This episode is a trackpads.com production.
When people picture Cambrai, they usually imagine the dawn attack itself. Tanks coming forward out of the mist, wire collapsing under their tracks, German defenders shocked by a new kind of assault. But before any of that could happen, the British had to solve a problem that was far less dramatic and just as important. They had to gather, move, hide, fuel, arm, repair, and position roughly 476 tanks and support vehicles for a surprise attack without allowing the whole effort to collapse under its own weight. That was an extraordinary logistical challenge for 1917. In many ways, the real miracle of Cambrai began before the battle. In rail sidings, workshops, wooded assembly areas, and maintenance lines, where the hidden labor of armored warfare was already taking shape. This podcast is accompanied by a companion book that expands the story of the Battle of Cambrai, with additional historical context, maps, and dozens of enhanced colorized photographs from the battle. Your purchase helps support our mission to keep these podcasts free. You can find the book at militaryauthor.me or at trackpads.com. A First World War tank was not something you simply pointed toward the front and told to keep going. The British Mark IV was slow, heavy, mechanically temperamental, and punishing to its crew even in ideal conditions. Long road marches wore machines out before combat even began, and every mile of movement risked breakdown, delay, or detection. That meant concentration for battle had to be handled with great care. Tanks needed to arrive close enough to the battlefield to attack on time, but not so close or so early that enemy observers or the noise of engines gave the whole plan away. In later wars, the logistical movement of armor would still be difficult, but Cambrai shows the challenge in an especially raw form. The British were not just moving men and ammunition, they were moving an entire new military system that still barely knew how to keep itself running. Railways, therefore, became the backbone of the effort. The Tank Corps could not march all of its vehicles from training grounds to the jumping-off points without exhausting machines and crews before the attack even started. So tanks were loaded onto flatbed railway trucks and carried toward the forward area in carefully organized stages. Images from the period showing Mark IV tanks loaded at Plateau Station capture something essential about Cambrai. This was not improvisation at the edge of battle. It was industrial movement, deliberate and methodical, using railway capacity to concentrate armored force in a way that road movement alone could not have achieved. The railway was not just transport. It was what made mass possible. Without it, the opening blow at Cambrai would have been smaller, later, noisier, and far less coherent. The concentration process itself was complicated and spread over days. Battalions trained near Arras and Wally, then shifted through tankadromes, sidings, workshops, and forward woods in a sequence that had to remain organized under great pressure. War diary entries show battalions entraining, detraining, driving to lying up places, moving again, and then waving under camouflage for the final approach to the starting line. Plateau became one of the central logistical nodes in this process, with battalions passing through it on their way into the forming up area. From there, tanks were moved toward places like Havrincourt Wood, Gouzecourt, Dessart Wood, and other sheltered zones closer to the battlefield. This mattered because an armored battle begins long before 0 hour. It begins when the machines are concentrated without losing readiness, and when the road from depot to battlefield is made orderly enough that surprise can survive the journey. Workshops were just as vital as railheads. Before Cambrai, the Tank Corps did not merely gather tanks and hope for the best. Crews and mechanics spent days overhauling machines, changing worn sprockets, addressing deficiencies, testing special equipment, and preparing vehicles as if for action, because many of them would have no second chance once the battle began. War diary entries repeatedly mention tanks being worked on, overhauled, or repaired, and replacement tanks being drawn when others failed before they could even be loaded. This is the unglamorous heart of armored warfare. A tank armor matures not when it learns how to attack, but when it learns how to prepare hundreds of machines for attack at once. At Cambrai, the Tank Corps was becoming an institution capable of that preparation, and that mattered as much as any tactical innovation on the day itself. One of the clearest signs of this logistical maturity was the handling of fascines, the great bundles used to help tanks cross especially wide trenches. These were not casual field improvisations thrown together at the last moment. They were built at central workshops, shaped and secured with care, and then moved toward the railway for transport. Because they made the tanks too tall for ordinary rail movement if mounted too early, they were carried separately and fitted later at the plateau railhead near Cambrai. Even that process had to be worked out mechanically, using cranes or carefully managed procedures to lift the fascine onto the tank's roof. This is an excellent example of how Cambrai combined engineering with logistics. The British were not just moving tanks. They were moving tanks plus the special equipment needed for a very specific problem on a very specific battlefield. The same was true of the support vehicles that are often forgotten when people hear the number 476. Not all of those machines were ordinary fighting tanks. The force also included supply tanks, wire-pulling tanks, spare tanks, and other specialized vehicles that existed to make the main assault possible. Wire-pulling tanks towed grapnels designed to drag flattened barbed wire clear enough for following traffic. Supply tanks were loaded for the needs of the battle, and in some cases prepared to tow sledges, a reminder that tracked armor could also serve as a carrier and hauler in a battlefield where ordinary transport might struggle. This is one of the deepest lessons of Cambrai. Armored warfare was not born as a pure duel of combat machines. It was born with support variants attached to it from the start, because even in its first major test, the tank already needed a family of logistical helpers around it. Fuel and ammunition added another layer of strain. A tank that reaches the battlefield without petrol is not a weapon. It is an obstacle. A tank that arrives without the ammunition, tools, and fittings it needs is only marginally better. War diary records describe battalions drawing petrol and ammunition during the movement toward plateau, while supply tanks and crews were loaded and organized for the attack. That effort is easy to miss because it does not produce a dramatic image like a tank crossing a trench. But it reveals how early armored warfare already depended on the steady movement of consumables. By the time later mechanized armies crossed North Africa, France, or the deserts of the Gulf, fuel would be recognized as one of the decisive currencies of battle. Cambrai shows that truth at its beginning. The tank did not enter history as an independent machine. It entered history already chained to fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and the men who carried them forward. Route preparation was another hidden battle within the battle. Tanks could not simply leave a siding and wander toward the front by intuition. Routes had to be reconnoitered, taped, pegged out, and, in some cases, worked on with Royal Engineers so that vehicles could move in darkness without wrecking the plan before dawn. War diary entries show officers coordinating with engineers, taping routes, staking assembly points, and preparing crossings over trenches in the forward area. Infantry guides were taken over the ground, because the entire system depended on tanks, infantry, and support elements arriving where they were supposed to be when they were supposed to be there. That kind of organization might sound pedestrian compared with the attack itself, but it is actually central to understanding mechanized warfare. Mobility is never just about engines. It is about prepared movement through space under time pressure, with enough order to keep different arms from colliding into confusion. Secrecy transformed all of this labor into something even harder. The Tank Corps was trying to move a large concentration of noisy, fragile machines toward the front without ruining the surprise that made the whole operation worth attempting. So many of the final movements took place at night, with tanks concealed in woods, dispersed in lying-up places, and camouflaged after arrival. Some units halted short of their exposed starting positions and waited until the last possible moment because enemy searchlights might detect them if they moved too early. That detail matters because it shows how fragile surprise really was. Cambrai did not depend on silence in the literal sense, since tanks were loud and rail movement was visible to those who got close enough. It depended on managing time, space, and concealment carefully enough that the Germans would not understand the scale and shape of the blow before it landed.
And like all real logistical efforts in war, this one was full of friction. Tanks broke down before the battle. Replacement vehicles had to be found. Trains derailed. Equipment was lost. At least one battalion recorded a derailment near Plateau in which 2 men were killed and several others injured before the battle had even begun. Fascines proved awkward to mount, with chains giving way during the process. Some tanks reached their starting points late because of mechanical trouble or because they had been ditched on the route.
Others arrived only after tense delays caused by exposure to enemy observation. These are not side notes. They are the real texture of armored logistics. A force does not arrive at battle in perfect parade formation.
It arrives after delays, substitutions, losses, improvisations, and the stubborn effort of crews and mechanics who refuse to let one failed truck or one damaged sprocket wreck the whole operation.
When the attack opened on the 20th of November, all of that hidden work suddenly became visible in results. The tanks were there in mass because the railheads had done their job. They crossed key obstacles because the workshops and engineers had prepared special equipment. They reached their lines in relative order because routes had been taped, assembly areas organized, and movement managed under darkness. Even then, the strain showed quickly. By the end of the first day, a large number of tanks were already out of action through enemy fire, mechanical failure, or the sheer punishment of the battlefield. That is not evidence that the logistics had failed. It is evidence of how much the system had already accomplished before combat began. The opening success at Cambrai rested on the fact that so many machines reached the battlefield ready enough to fight at all. Cambrai showed that tanks could not be treated as isolated novelties. They had to be concentrated by rail, sustained by workshops, equipped for special tasks, fed with petrol and ammunition, protected by camouflage, and guided forward by reconnaissance and engineering preparation. Every later generation of armored warfare would rediscover the same principle in different forms. Fast vehicles may capture attention, but the hidden system behind them decides whether they arrive, whether they fight, and whether they can fight again. At Cambrai, long before the great mechanized campaigns of the later 20th century, that truth was already becoming visible. The tank reached maturity not only when it broke through wire, but when an army learned how to move an armored force into battle without it falling apart on the way.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.